Well, within residential schools, they started teaching homophobia, they started teaching transphobia.
I've always sort of knew that I was gay about 15 years old, and at that time I knew nothing about my culture, nothing about who I was or where I came from.
It was really hard for me because I was raised in a Christian home, and most of my family, my grandparents, they were in residential schools, so...
What's at risk when we are not talking about Two-Spirit issues? Is Two-Spirit people themselves? Is our First Nations cultures also falling back into this homo-negative idea and this trans-negative idea? And at risk is our future generations pretty much learning exactly what was taught the first year of residential school. We need to start to decolonize ourselves, and through talking about Two-Spirit issues, we are getting at the root of decolonization. We are starting to renegotiate our cultures for ourselves.
Welcome to Saskatchewan, the Prairie Province. We're home to over 157,000 Aboriginal people. Of those people, many identify as Cree, Mohawk, Dakota, Saulteaux, Métis. But there's also one other thing that many Aboriginal people identify as: Two-Spirit. But taking the journey of Indigenous gender identity, even with a history on these lands of at least 11,000 years, Two-Spirit people in Saskatchewan and across North America are playing a huge role in the fight for decolonization, and they have everything at stake. So, let's go back.
So I'm from the Samson Cree Nation in Musqueam, Alberta, and it's taken me a little while to get to the knowledge about Two-Spirit stuff, because it's actually it's not something that a lot of First Nations peoples talk about, and it's taken a long time for us to actually get to talk about it. But before the whole blacklisting happened, when we're looking at the Two-Spirit culture in First Nations cultures, it was quite vibrant. They're openly accepted as members of the community. We had various roles. We could be caregivers to orphan children, or we'd be medicine people, or chiefs, or mediators. And Two-Spirit people were seen as being gifted in a way that they could have the insight of both a male perspective and a female perspective.
Two-Spirit people played a lot of different roles in a lot of different communities. Yes, sometimes they provided spiritual guidance or were counselors, but in many communities, Two-Spirit people were just other members of society. In some languages, there are specific words for Two-Spirit people, but being that Indigenous languages are not split on a gender-based binary, meaning male or female, many languages didn't separate them in any way. So Two-Spirit people's roles were varied from tribe to tribe, but all Indigenous communities have one thing in common. Pre-contact, there were people with all sorts of gender identities.
Well, within residential schools, they started teaching homophobia, they started teaching transphobia. They saw a number of different atrocities that happened within the residential schools, and it's so disheartening to think that Two-Spirit people were living through this and having to be subjected to these abusive behaviors, these abusive mantras that told them they're wrong, that told them they're bad, and they shouldn't be existing. And the amount of suicides that you can just imagine were happening.
Within residential schools across the country, Indigenous kids faced many atrocities, but for the first time they were taught a gender binary, and that also means they were taught that you had to be male or female, a man or a woman, and follow the imposed rules of how a man or woman should act for the very first time. If they didn't, it was serious consequences, abuse, or even death. Not only in residential schools, but with contact, the Indian Act actually legislated gender identity for the very first time. What this means is more or less that gender diverse people who had existed for thousands of years were suddenly told they couldn't exist anymore.
The systematic blacklisting are living them out of history books. We have the residential schools and the introduction of homophobia and transphobia, and how that's been put down the generations from great-great-grandfather all the way down to me as well, where within First Nations cultures where we're seeing quite a lot of homophobia, because that's what Christianity taught us. So that's what these priests had taught us, and now we're teaching it to our children, and we're at this point where we have to stop that.
I'm from Manitoba originally. I grew up in the bush. I'm a bush bunny. Totally isolated from everything till I was about 15 when we moved to the prairies. I had no idea about sexual identities and genders and all of that. That wasn't really on my radar. I mean, if you look at the whole process of reclaiming your cultural and spiritual tradition, that only started in the 60s, because it had been underground up until then. And the places that have had more contact have had more corruption, as it were, more taken away. Where up north or in further, more remote places, some of the people never had that contact, so they don't have the same depth of contamination in a sense, and they've been like the language and the traditions or the land use and the relations, it's all maintained, and the further north you go, the less judgment there is in that regard.
As intergenerational trauma took hold across the country, even after the last federally operated residential school closed, the ideas of a separation of man and woman had already become systemic. And those ideas had permeated their way into some First Nations cultures and teachings.
That whole binary, are you a boy or a girl? Because now there's a lot of youth that are exploring, the transgender stuff and everything. And they go to a ceremony in their school, and the boys sit on one side and the girls sit on the other, which is the way things are. But there's no choice as to where the people that are moving from one to the other, they have no choice as to where they sit, and that's not right, because there's always respect and responsibility for who you are in that circle. I mean, if you come in, you have your place and you take it, and nobody can tell you that's not your place, ever. But it's not like that, because some of that power abuse that comes from that patriarchy, it totally contaminates that process.
It's that world the Two-Spirit people, and particular Two-Spirit youth, are trying to navigate. A world where your culture and spirituality may have been so permeated by colonization that you no longer feel welcome in what should be the safest place. It's also a world where the urban population, and even the queer urban population, may hold stereotypes and prejudices about who you are. And so there are real-world consequences. Two-Spirit people have a suicide rate 10% higher than other Canadians. They are also statistically more likely to be unemployed, homeless, and suffer from addictions.
My name is Andre Bear. I am a graduate from Oskayak High School. I live in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and my reserve is Little Pine First Nation, which is about half hour west of North Battleford.
My name is Malachi Turner McAdam. I'm from Sturgeon Lake First Nation. That's about 30 kilometers north of Prince Albert. Yeah.
I really didn't figure out I was two-spirited until I was about 15 or 16 years old. And that was while I was living in Saskatoon. And it's really not that interesting of a story. And I don't know, it's nothing too exciting, but I guess I slowly just started figuring out myself one day. And it the way I explain it is it kind of hit me like a tidal wave. And it hit me all at once. And it's really hard to explain, but it's kind of like the way someone would fall in love with someone, and it's just a feeling that comes out of nowhere, and something you can never get rid of. And it happened to me all in one night, and it was actually pretty terrifying for me. Well, it's all very interconnected with finding myself and the way I started my culture and the way I started school at Oskayak, actually. Like, I've always knew that I was different going to other schools like Bedford and Mount Royal and all these other high schools in Saskatoon. And that was the time that I really lost my path. And I was a very, very lost young man. And I was kicked out of countless high schools in Saskatoon, Nutana, Mount Royal, Bedford, one in Alberta. But it was all due to violence, me fighting, and drugs and alcohol and a lot of stuff like that. I was a very, very different person from who I am now. And a lot of that was going to Oskayak and finally finding my culture and finding who I am through the culture. And what I found through that was the love and the acceptance and how everyone has a role in the circle of life and a lot of things like that. And that's when I truly began to accept myself and find my passions and who I am as a young native boy living in the city. There is different setbacks about going to ceremonies and being two-spirited, and that's because it does get confusing sometimes, but I truly believe as long as there's other young men like Malachi and myself who attend these ceremonies and that go about this way to learn this traditional knowledge, in the future I do see time of that old knowledge coming back into our ceremonies and stuff like that, so we can feel more fit and in place when we attend those types of things.
So growing up, I didn't know what being gay was. I was raised in a Christian home. My mom, well, now she's a pastor. So growing up in a reserve, it was different. It was really confusing for me. Going through school, maybe when I was about 9 or 10 years old, I started realizing that I like boys, and it was weird for me because I was so confused. People would tell me that it was wrong. Most of my family, my grandparents, they were in residential schools, so we had nobody in our family was traditional. They didn't know anything about their culture. They didn't practice that. They only practiced Christianity, going to church, Pentecostal. Just recently, I've started also getting into my culture, attending ceremonies and practicing it more. And it's really helped me, as a young gay man, to be more comfortable and free with myself. I'm not ashamed of myself anymore. I'm more proud. And now I came out to my mom just this year, and it was really hard. She didn't accept it at first. She stopped talking to me.
I would get confused, or we'd be sitting in a ceremony and they would separate the men from the women, and they would have the men talking and the women talking about their whatever they talk about. And I guess at one point I was sitting with the men, and I asked an elder And I asked him, well, I'm two-spirited, like I don't like women, and well, I love women. It's just it's not my thing, because that's what they were talking about. They were talking about the roles of being a husband and all of these things like that. And I said, well, where do I go? I said, do I go sit with the women? And he said, well, no, because you're a man. And it was very difficult, because not even he knew really what to do, because a lot of those teachings are lost as two-spirited people, a lot of them. They're not lost and gone forever, because I honestly believe that all of these teachings and all of these roles and responsibilities can be brought back simply by asking the other side what we have to do. Because from my experience, anytime you ask them something, they answer. And it's always been a really beautiful thing for me growing up and discovering my culture and learning just how very real it is and how very real that other side can be. And it's a powerful thing, and I feel very gifted to be nehio and to be two-spirited. It's very honoring, and there is different setbacks about going to ceremonies and being two-spirited, and that's because it does get confusing sometimes. But I truly believe, as long as there's other young men like Malachi and myself who attend these ceremonies and that go about this way to learn this traditional knowledge, in the future I do see time of that old knowledge coming back.
The lived experiences of two-spirit people today, although directly linked through oppression started at contact, vary completely from person to person. But something agreed upon throughout the two-spirit community across Turtle Island is that those stories need to be shared.
My name is Ryan Jimmy. I'm a graduate student here in the College of Education in the Department of Educational Foundations. I'm from Onion Lake First Nation. My research project is titled Perceptions of Identity from GSD, Gender Sexually Diverse First Nation post-secondary students. And basically the study is just looking at how participants who identify as GSD or two-spirited conceptualize or perceive their identities, and how did they come into those perspectives, and I took a class called Indigenous Methodologies, and the class really helped me self-locate and really helped me question, why am I here? Why am I even in graduate school? And I always came back to my own personal experiences. Growing up on a First Nations reserve, someone who is gay, I struggled with a lot of oppression within my own community. And then also moving to urban areas, I struggled with a lot of racism within just the mainstream white community, but also the larger queer community as well. But at the same time, within university, I found a way to kind of unpack those forms of oppression to the point where I wasn't feeling so bad about myself. I almost felt empowered, because I was realizing that I'm just a part of this system that has been structured in a way to oppress people from my group. And I really wanted to know how other students who have similar experiences of mine, how did they come to understand their identities, and what empowers them to strive forward? Because the research says, we still have a lot of two-spirit youth who are committing suicide, who are leaving their communities, but yet there are some who are finding a way to navigate those forms of oppression. So this has just been a really awesome journey. Someone who really struggled with my identity, but somehow, going to school here at the university has helped me unpack those forms of oppression. And I just think, there's so many youth out there who are still struggling, and I truly believe, if there's a way that we can connect, that they'll also thrive. And I think that's the heart of being a First Nations person, is finding a way to share what you're good at, And I feel like being in a university, that's what I'm good at. You know, other people have other things that they're good at, but I think we need to use those gifts to support each other. And that's something that my dad taught me. You know, he told me, you know, every time he hunts, the first thing he does is go to an elder. He shares that kill with the elders, because they've taught him so much about being a First Nation person. It's his way of nurturing them and giving back. So I really value my research as a way of giving back to people. So that's about it.
So, what's at risk when we aren't talking about Two-Spirit issues?
What's at risk is lives. We will lose Two-Spirit people to suicide, to other violence from other individuals, and we'll lose them to our own cultures. They will leave and they will not come back because they don't feel represented, they don't feel loved, they don't see that our communities are accepting them. So we need to see that by not talking about Two-Spirit issues, that is violence against our own people. That is violence against our own future generations when we don't talk about Two-Spirit issues.